And we're live. Welcome to you, the viewer, and welcome to our fantastic panel. It's the After Dram, and that means it's time to unwind. So put your feet up, grab a dram or two, and relax. So as a quick recap to our early afternoon and evening for Fionnan, Dave, Jason, Kent, Sean, and I have done a deep dive into the second third of this book right here. That one. A Glass Apart, Irish Single Pot Still Whiskey. Fantastic book. You should get it if you don't have it already. It was fun. It was educational. And we heard something about a sexy something. I came up somewhere from someone. I'm not sure what. It was fun and educational. I came up lots. So we're going to have another round of introductions, if we could, kind gentlemen. And we're going to do the same thing. Start with Fionnan, and then we'll go alphabetically through it. What's in your glasses now?
I am polishing off something that's been with me all of lockdown, which is a Redbreast 21, which I think I singled out in that book. So just at the tail, this has been in the house for a long time, but it was in the house for a long time, and then the rate at which it went down was basically accelerated with lockdown. So
once you open
tail end, so I don't want to oxidize and finish it off. So that's what's in the glass this time around.
Excellent. And perfect dram. I love the 21. Dave, what you got, buddy? Oh, you're muted, buddy. I'll do that. There you go.
Hold on a second. How's that?
You're perfect now. You're always perfect.
I need somebody to help me. I'm drinking the same Kilbeggan that I had earlier today, and I think I'm starting to slow down because I can really feel the effects. It's delicious.
It is delicious. Good job. Jason.
Like Dave, I'm drinking the same bottle that I had in the first hour, which is a Yellow Spot 12-year-old. And I thought I was drinking it pretty quick, but I'm looking at the line on Dave's bottle, and I think he's winning right now.
Okay. You're doing all right. You're doing okay.
It's not a race. There's no betting allowed here.
Yeah.
We also know that Dave's going to go for a nap after this. Hi, my name is Kent. I go by Whiskey Ass on pretty much all platforms. I sent my wife to the store because we have a grandson is having a birthday this afternoon. And I said, while you're there, get us some actual pot still because I'm almost embarrassed. That being said, the West Court, for blended, it's pretty damn delicious. So not unhappy with my choice.
You sent Cheryl to the liquor store for the kid's birthday?
Well,
that's what I heard too, Dave. That's what I heard.
Shopping for his birthday. So while she's out, stop at the liquor store. It's on your path.
No, that's a good comment. Way to go. Sean.
Ken just wants a present as well,
Yeah.
Hi, it's Sean Kincaid. I go by Sean Kincaid on everything. I'm the most original nickname on social media. Excellent. And I'm also co-host of the Lost in Translation Park Whiskey podcast, and that's at parkwhiskey.podbean.com. And I saved my Middleton Barry Crockett, nice. And I also grabbed single cask Cooley single malt 13-year in refill Oloroso, which is one of my favorite Irish single malts.
The single cast nation one is fantastic. I love that. And I tried to find my SMWS Cooley, but I ran out of time, so I just went to the Yellow Spot. Well, and because Jason has it, so we could talk about the same thing. So I cracked open my newest Yellow Spot because my other one miraculously disappeared somehow. I don't know how it disappeared. My wife doesn't know either. It was fairly new, what she thought. But gentlemen, a quote, because I didn't do quotes so much last week, but I'm in the mood for quotes this week. So right here, let's start with that one. Georgian Dublin would find itself producing a tax-dodging distillate made from inefficient mash that would go on to become the most beloved liquor in the British Empire, the old Irish pot still whiskey. And I just wanted to throw that because that's what we're all enjoying right now. So, and another quote right here. Go for two. Why not? Get that one off and do this one. So distilling was a seasonal activity carried out by farmers or planned communally around a shared still house run by an appointed member of the parish. Now, Nick brought this up previous to her, her handle's Black Cat Whiskey, about maybe lost information about female brewers or distillers. And my question's around the same thing, Fionnan. My maternal grandmother farming in community in New Brunswick, it was the women that brewed the beer, and I'm not sure about distilling there. How much have you found, or have you found very much information on women distillers in the 17th, 18th century point in time? Is there information out there?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, you know, and across Europe, you have the whole alewives. You know, the idea when brewing was domestic activity, it was considered, you know, women's work, and so yeah, most of the brewers would have been women. With distilling, it's a bit less clear. The big thing that happens with distilling as opposed to brewing is criminalization. So when home distilling is illegal, it you know, if you want to, the two trajectories, one is commercialization and the other is criminalization. And if you want to like shove women out of something in the 18th century, the ways you do it is either turn it into a business or turn it into a, you know, criminal racket, and then you make sure,
them a witch.
those are the two easiest way to make sure you have men running it. So yeah, when you start seeing, like during the 1700s is when it really, you know, becomes, so like 1661 is the date of the excise, so it's really only 1760 to 1779 that you get the hard crackdown on private distillation being. It used to be perfectly legal to distill at home so long as you weren't selling it. And then it was so ambiguous, someone would just say, well, I wasn't going to sell it, I was just making it, that between 1760 and 1779, with 2 acts, there's a crackdown just saying home distilling is illegal. And now, you know, of course, most parts of the world, you know, not all parts of the world, but certainly here, home distilling is illegal. But then you go to places, you know, like, you know, Portugal or New Zealand, oddly enough, Hungary, I think, you know, home distilling is still legal. And what we're always told is, well, it's illegal because you can kill yourself. And yes, you can, but that's not why it's illegal. If you look at the historical sources, it's all to do with excise and, you know, commercial. Yeah, absolutely. So when you see it become illicit, then you start seeing, and, you know, poaching in the 1700s was organized crime. It wasn't, you know, when we think of like poaching in Ireland, we're thinking of like nostalgic about the 20th century, really. And, you know, old fellas in flat caps dodging the clumsy police. Whereas you look at the 1700s and it's often highly organized. It's you know, brazen bands riding into towns and cities selling this stuff. But you also get in the real heartland of poaching, like Donegal and places, you get the sense of a communal activity, that you have whole communities that are based around it. And there you do see women involved. You see, you know, where they're so secure because they're literally in the middle of nowhere, that they don't have to worry about well, they do have to worry about, but there's a whole community kind of, you know, infrastructure around it. Okay. And so there you see it. But then when you get, you know, the lone distiller out in the, you know, whatever in some thatchy, you know, hideaway, avoiding the smoke being seen, then you start seeing the like, you know, masculinizing of illicit distilling. And then of course, you know, 19th century commerce being what it was, of course, you know, deeply patriarchal. So yeah, as in, you know, so many things, women are edged out over time, you know.
And well, let's continue. We'll come back to this in a little bit, but I think it's funny. People are funny, and people are really funny when it comes to whiskey. It really is. Can anyone on this panel think of another substance that, when taxed or illegal, made people want it more? So it becomes illegal, and they want to break the law even more now. So maybe that comes from my ancestors in Ireland and the Scots. Same thing. It's you're saying this is wrong. You're telling me I can't do what I want, and you're saying it's wrong. I think I'm going to do it now, and I've never done it before. But and we've got this. Yeah. Well, okay, that's it. Prostitution.
I haven't done it, but I hear a lot about it.
The after dram gets better and better, Dave. First Kent is sent out instead of doing stuff for his grandchildren. His lovely wife gets the booze. We were making fun of him, Cheryl, before you showed up, and now we're on to prostitution. So prostitution, once people knew that it was illegal, became more popular. Is that what you're saying there, Dave? Good. I'll let you think about that. Yeah. I thought marijuana. No, go ahead, but yeah.
Well, I thought marijuana too, but I thought prostitution would go better on this show.
And what kind of show are we flogging here, people?
I'm not sure. But sorry, Fionnan. When was, I think not last October, October previous to that, marijuana was legalized here in Canada, and people thought that it was going to become something much more than it is right now. There's stores everywhere where you can buy it, but the pictures, and it reminds me of the picture you had of the everyday person that was drunk on the streets, and, the child's coming off the woman's breast, and everyone's partying it up. I think they were thinking it was going to become the same thing here in Canada with marijuana. As soon as it became legalized, everyone was going to be stoned on the streets and not caring about your children and whatever. So yeah, that's the picture.
That's the picture.
So, apart from prostitution, is there something else that became more popular when they were told that it was illegal? And I just think
wanting to go to work, wanting to leave home, the amount of people who have suddenly develop an interest in like going to an office. I
miss the office so much. Yes.
Of not sitting at home on the couch, absolutely.
That's funny.
But isn't it anything that we're told we can't have, we want?
Sure.
I look at drinking laws in Europe versus drinking laws here.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just like 14-year-olds in Germany can drink. Here, I mean, the world would come to an end if the liquor board ever heard about that.
What's the drinking age in Canada? Is it 18 or 21?
18. Oh,
18
19
here.
in some provinces as well. So 19 max.
Well,
21 is the states.
Yeah.
There's certain states for us, but not us. Okay. We're going back to the birthplace of whiskey, because I wanted to deal with this in the previous one, kind of wrap it up. But I thought what you were suggesting, or what maybe be a compromise that you related in the book, was Islay being the birthplace of whiskey. And I thought it was perfect because they were geographically between the two land masses that are doing it. And I'm wondering if the rest of the panel could get behind that. Is that something we could promote and just say it wasn't Ireland, Scotland, it was Islay? Anyone else think that that's a good one? No one.
I'll go with whatever's going on because I've got nothing to say that person's wrong.
Well, also, I wouldn't actually suggest that myself. Again, I wouldn't say there was a birthplace of whiskey at all. There's the roots. Yeah. What do you call whiskey? Barrel-aged, uncompounded liquor comes much later. So then, is it grain liquor? But that's a different thing altogether. Is it distillation? I think the bit in the book was about the ambiguity around Islay. Not that whiskey is invented on Islay. And again, like I'd be strongly of the opinion that whiskey wasn't invented full stop, that it evolves over time. So one thing that I didn't have access to in when I was writing the book, and I don't think is popular knowledge now, even in whiskey circles, but next book certainly, I managed to find there's a heap of manuscripts in Trinity College. Gaelic medical texts, and I managed to find this academic article by a man who's dead now, Micheál Crahúr, and it's an academic article in Irish. So two reasons nobody would have read it. One, it's an academic article. It's an academic article in an Irish language academic journal. 3, it's an Irish language article in an academic journal writing about texts that are in a dated form of Irish, it's unreadable. Something. It's not technically Old Irish. It's something called Classical Gaelic, which was a shared high literary standard that Scots Gaelic and Irish had for a long time. This kind of mutually intelligible written form, and Anyway, the first, and I feel guilty presenting this stuff because really it was this guy who found it. But again, writing in a totally different context outside the sphere of whiskey. And unfortunately, I tried to find him and he's passed away. But he was in charge of cataloging some of these back in the 90s. And as far as I can tell, it's the first use of the word Ishkabaha, the root Ishkabaha in Irish, Ishkava in Scots Gaelic. The first use of the word that became the word whiskey, and it's a medical tract in 1415 by it's by several people, but the scribe is a guy named Abe O'Lean. And anyway, you have and then the authorship is to a guy named Tygo Quing, and there's several students, and A seems to have been one of his students. But anyway, they are Gaelic translations of something called Concilia Medicinalia, which was Mediterranean distilling literature, probably one of the great texts of distilling, Tadeo Alvarati. And oddly enough, the very first reference to distilling in Ireland is the Red Book of Ossory, which is in Latin and is not actually a record of whiskey at all. It's just almost a literal copy of Concilia Medicinalia in a hymnal. Okay. So you're seeing the same text, but now Oscailiga instead of in Latin. And then you start seeing versions of that same translation, as well as several other translations popping up in the beaten. So, in the High Middle Ages, you had what were called a luna, and they're hereditary doctor families. And there's probably in Ireland, they tend to have names that had to do with medicine. So the name O'Hickey in Ireland, Hickey is just doctor, healer. The McKinley, actually, Machinlay, son of the leech. Or not McKinley, Maclay. And then of course Beaton, which very, very famous in Scotland, probably the most well-known olive or Luna family. And Beaton is actually an anglicization of Baha, of life, the same Ishkabaha Ushkava. So their original surname was MacBaha. And when you look at these records, you see Beaton library translations popping up in like the Isle of Mull, and because they were the hereditary doctors to the Lords of the Isles, the Riach Gao, who were headquartered on Finlagan Castle and Isla. And so you start seeing this example of literal copies of text being spread across a medical class, across what was then a shared Gaelic world. So it's that kind of thing. I have very little time for, like the stories that say like, oh, Irish monks rocked up with a bowl of whiskey and taught the Scots how to do it. And of course, naturally, it's much more about cultural transfusion, in shared spheres of knowledge. And Isla is very much at the heart of this, and was a power under the Lords of the Isles, and a power that straddled, both Antrim and that goes back to an earlier era where you had something called Del Riada, which was a kingdom straddling both. But you have this visible, and and I'm a big fan of proof. I'm a big fan of evidence of one kind or another. And for me, this was a wellspring and largely untapped. And I was meant to go off to the National Library of Scotland before COVID hit. A lot of the Beaton stuff is in the NLS. And it's been held up, but and it's not really to do with the PhD. Like all of that will be one sentence and a footnote. So it's stuff to be held for a totally different project down the line. But really fascinating that you see that transmission, and you get people in the Scotch industry who will have an awareness to say, oh, the Beatons. You go to Isla, Kilholman Distillery, make a big deal about the Beatons. But there isn't enough kind of fingers in the dirt research making its way into the whiskey world, as it were. And hopefully we can do that, because the stuff is fascinating. And you look at the fact that the source material is Gaelic translations of Latin texts that are themselves from Mediterranean medicine that is itself, influenced by the Arabic world. And you have this kind of spread across. There's Gaelic translations of Avicenna that pop up. So again, via Latin, but direct from the Arabic world without kind of Mediterranean centers. And a lot of that stuff is, I think, you see that the kind of transition as the texts get later and later from hard medical texts to folklore, basically. It moves from like medieval medicine to like add some honey to this if you have a cold and it'll cure it. You know, the kind of transmission into folk medicine. And I'd be a much bigger fan of that, of the like cultural sphere and diffusion into grassroots culture than, you know, a birthplace or this happened, so then the other, you know. I think there's a lot.
Well, there's confusion with the birthplace of it. There's also confusion of just the words themselves. And here, let's throw up another quote. Here we go. Uskabritha was the name used by the rural Irish speakers, while Uskaba was the standard Anglicization. Used in Dublin. If this weren't confusing enough, the designations themselves weren't very defined. And so I'm going to ask you, Fionnan, if you can give us a simplified versions of the difference between all of these.
Grant, we'll start with Uskaba, because that's the one that usually annoys me, and you see this a lot, especially in the Scotch industry. Because well, even at a very motley level, the Irish language is mandatory in schools in Ireland, in the Republic of Ireland. So even if you don't remember a word of it, you kind of remember what it looks like and spells like. Whereas, you know, Scotland Gaelic is a much more regional minority language. Uskaba is not a Gaelic or an Irish word. There's no Q's in the Gaelic alphabet. You know, it just doesn't exist. Itself, just an earlier, it's all bullshit. The Scots Gaelic for whiskey is Uskaba. And it's spelled just like the Irish, but with a G instead of a C. And that's only because we had a spelling reform in the 50s. They used to be spelled identically. But Ishkabaha, Uskaba, those are the two Gaelic words of one kind or another. Uskaba is itself, a kind of a halfway house between Gaelic or Gaelic and English. And so for a long time, the word in English is Uskaba, which is a kind of an approximation. And then you see terms like Uskibe or Uskaba or, you know, Uskaba. That's the same one, you know, anything in between. And then you see like Usk and Usky and whiskey and so forth. And it's only in kind of the 1750s, you know, a lot of the stuff called Uskaba, which is one anglicization of Ishkabaha, eventually starts referring, and Charlie McLean has been great about tracking this. You see the term Uskaba hangs around as a term for compounded spirit with honey and raisins and fennel and stuff kicking into it. And whiskey starts to mean commercial, uncompounded, barrel-aged, you know, what we would call whiskey. And Uskaba, which is itself, you know, and just another anglicization of the same concept. That anglicization hangs around as a word, and you see in Ireland as well. You get this what we call big house. You know, there's a whole psychological thing in Irish history around the big house, the estate. You know, the absentee landlord of the big house. You see the big house records, cookbooks take a liking to this stuff in the 1700s. And it was said. In one article, I remember very, very evocatively said, you know, the two aspects of Gaelic, the old Gaelic feudal class that were adopted by the kind of like Anglo-Irish establishment were harping and Uskaba. Were the two things brought in, and, you know, harping continued to be patronized and was kind of adopted. And Uskaba, and you have compounded, often quite elaborately compounded drinks, you know, and they eventually become kind of a punch, but they basically become a kind of a dead end in whiskey, you know, and that history and pounding falls out of the other altogether. And then, you know, punching becomes the drink of the agrarian poor and very different to what it was before, you know, or the many things it was before. Uskaba is just an old word for whiskey that's not quite a Gaelic word and not quite, well, it is an English word. It's just not the English word we use. And then, after the fact, people just well-meaning but mistaken constantly in the whiskey industry say Uskaba is especially the Scots Gaelic for whiskey, which is most certainly not.
Yeah.
And any Gaelic speaker would say the exact same thing. Again, it's that spelling doesn't remotely exist in the Goidelic, you know, orthography.
So we're going to accept everything, or what should we accept? And when we see it out there, if we want to get on our high horse and tell someone they're right, wrong, what should I tell them? It's like that. Any way you want, just drink it and enjoy it. Or
are we talking about what we call it? You should call it whiskey, or you'll really sound
I'm just
I only call it Ishkabaha. Yeah, I mean, again, like the standard Irish is Ishkabaha, the standard Scots Gaelic is Uskava. They're the same phrase. They're both themselves a Goidelic translation of the Latin aquavit in the first place, you know, and then in the same route, as I'm sure you guys probably know, as eau de vie and aquavit and all these various drinks over across Europe. So they began, and even when I was talking about early texts and you're looking at these like that are Gaelic translations of Latin texts that are coming from Europe, it's part of a shared, and that's why, again, I'd shy away from the idea of like the invention of whiskey, because even at the beginning, you're talking about how connected these places were to a wider sphere of ideas, you know, that are coming in from abroad.
Okay. And I will remember. Call it whiskey. Well, if I had a better accent, maybe I would say something else, but it's whiskey or Scotch or whatever it is. I need to go back to something you said previously, and obviously you said all this previously. But anyways, in the spirit of transition from cloister to farm, and you talk about that. So right now we're doing that from cloister to farm. It's becoming whiskey at one point. And you say, if I were a betting man, I would get that it first spread into common practice somewhere with, and we said you have 5 points, and 3 I get, 2 I just have a little bit of question about. So 1, a sustainable crop yield, which makes complete sense. A pastoral community with the need for draft. And when you say draft, is that just for livestock, or is there something else that it could be used for?
Primarily livestock. I mean, Ireland, and to a certain degree Scotland, certainly the Scottish Highlands were pastoral communities. They relied more on livestock than they did on farming.
Okay. No, that's perfect. Plenty of informal trade, but don't most of them have informal trade, right? Or
yes.
I'm wondering if you're getting to something I'm not seeing.
Informal trade at the expense of hard currency. You know,
okay.
More informal trade than hard currency, like you saw with like the Western frontier in the U.S., you know, where rye whiskey becomes a kind of a commodity, you know, for lack of currency as much as anything.
Perfect. And the absence of hops, or they would have made beer. Are we assuming they would make beer just because it's easier to make?
Well, they did make ale. That's the big thing. Is just, you know, that they made ale long before they made whiskey. But again, they don't
hop
preservative exactly. So, you know, it's one way to make ale not go off. And of course, there's cruder forms of gruit, but they're not nearly as effective as hops. You know, heather does not work as well as hops as a preservative.
Okay.
You know, so you see stuff kicking around, but it's not, you know.
And the last one, a strong need for and this was my biggest question, the strong need for an alternative means of routinely preserving that traded drink back and forth over, say, the oose itself. And what do you mean by traded back and forth? Or could you just expand on that itself?
That was just a joke about Islay. The trade over the Ishka itself. So Ishka's water. So again, like obviously, and you see, you know, what's really interesting is you see that body of water, Islay to the North Ulster coast, the Inishowen Peninsula, the North Antrim route, and then out to the Mull of Kintyre and Islay. And there continues to be this illicit traffic of poaching. I mean, there's some wonderful folk songs in Scots Gaelic about what they would call putdew or puchdew, black pot, which is the same thing as poaching, being transported, being rowed from Ireland to Islay, again, and that's long after, you know, the early years of whiskey. That's the 1800s. So, you know, you look out, like I was on Islay recently enough, actually, for a BBC program, and Jim McEwen of all people was reminding me that he can see Donegal from Islay. He said, "Oh yeah, if you go out to the west," now I knew they could see Antrim, the kind of like nearest part of Ireland, but they can even see the northwest of Ireland from the other end of Islay. So they really are a triangular space. And then you get, when you take this terrifying kind of little rib boat that gets you from Antrim, it actually leaves quite close to Bushmills, and it'll get you to Port Ellen very quickly. And when you're leaving, you can see the Mull of Kintyre, where Campbellton is, on one end, and then you come up to Islay. You realize how close this whole, you know, sphere actually was. And then you get this, you know, and you start seeing records from, people like Fynes Morrison administration when they talk about Ishkabaha in Ireland, and they immediately start talking about how it's transported to the Inner Hebrides, this shared sphere back and forth. You get things like the Statutes of Iona, which is a kind of a crackdown on the Hebridean self-rule, as it were, by the Stuarts within Scotland. And they even reference, this inordinate love of aqua vita, made partly among themselves and partly purchased from the mainland. So you get this idea, okay, if they're getting it from Mullintyre and it's coming to Ireland, and the stuff going from Ireland to Ireland back and forth, you get this notion developing of this weird, trilateral booze trade. And of course, it just makes a lot of sense. There was a lot of back and forth in general. It's easier to get to each other than it is to, certainly to like Edinburgh.
It's really treacherous waters, though, is it not?
It's pretty grim, yeah. If you ever do that rib, and it's fun. You start in Bushmills, you can have a kind of day there and get to Isla. I got stranded there once, because they wouldn't run the boats because it was choppier than usual, and so I ended up being lost on Isla. I forgot to bring a razor, so I had like a Robinson Crusoe beard, and I just wandered around, did the whole loop. Again, each day they probably got really sick of seeing me, just while I'm still here, I might as well go to, okay, I'll go to Brookladdy today again. Of course there's Corryvreck and Whirlpool there, which is, they have to keep away from. It can be, but even on the normal route, you find yourself kind of doing, the dancing waves. You're kind of doing the Michael Flatley as you're on this bouncing little boat. I actually, on that documentary, the poor director, the BBC program, the poor director got seasick and was vomiting over the side of the boat. And then I was there at the helm being filmed, going like, Isla, cradle of peated whiskey, blah, blah, your man, to see it coming up, so I felt really asinine, giving this speech while the poor man is off the other end of the boat, off camera. But yeah, very, very close. It doesn't take long to get, 6 minutes.
Treacherous.
Yeah.
I just know after our last book, I am not taking a boat to Isla.
You have to fly.
There is no way I'm going on a boat.
You want to end up on the rocks?
I've got a sequence of questions. It all comes, and it's kind of with Connor that he mentioned. So I'm thinking about him, and you said they're doing some very unique things with the grains. So Connor Ryan, correct? That was it. So really unique things with the grains. And I'm wondering, in your research, because I'm hoping they're getting information from you, you're getting information from them to help in your research as well. But what brings you to a point where you get the information? Are you following what's being grown in a region and then trying to meld that with the mash bill of the time? So when you're doing your research, are you looking for mash bills, or are you looking for the grains being grown to kind of match the mash bill at the time? I'm trying to think the genesis of that.
More finding the mash bills and then looking at agriculture after the fact as a way of justifying motives, because there's an awful lot of extrapolatory bullshit where people say, oh well, there was wheat grown here, so the wheat must have been in the whiskey. And there's no evidence for any of this. And sometimes it can be really horrible. Like you hear people say, there was a mill here, and that means there was distilling, and it's complete nonsense, and usually with a marketing agenda. And I think it's you find the proof that something happened, and then you try and prove your own argument as to why it might have been chosen or why it might have happened, and but working from hard facts wherever possible, So you see excise records or court cases or things. Now people can still lie, and you should always be careful about treating everything and all things with a grain of salt. But yeah, you want to avoid building history on what are really suppositions, because there's enough suppositions just arguing why something happened, saying, well, okay, there's more wheat. So one of the arguments I make is that, you look in the early 1800s and there's a large amount of wheat used in the early 19th century that disappears toward the end of the 19th century. Now, there was a wheat tillage boom in Ireland in the early years of the 1800s, because Napoleon put an embargo on wheat getting to Britain during the Peninsular War, and Ireland was suddenly artificially cultivated with loads of wheat to feed what was then Britain. For the first time in its history, became a net grain importing country because of rising population. So say, okay, this might, and then Battle of Waterloo, end of the embargo, the price of wheat falls through the floor, and then of course Ireland has the famine in the 1840s. So using those agricultural histories as a way of arguing as to why wheat was huge during the embargo years and then collapsed, that all makes quite a bit of sense. But you're trying to, there's enough suppositions that you have to defend arguing why something happened, instead of like arguing that something may have happened because of the, instead of going backwards, if I had found no records of high wheat and saying, oh, well, there was this embargo, blah, blah, and Ireland was growing a lot of wheat. So there must have been a lot of wheat mash bills. It's a much harder argument to defend.
Okay. No, and that makes sense. I was trying to find it. And there's lots of tidbits of information about the different grains. And one of them that I thought was really cool was malted oats. And I didn't ask the panel, do we malt our oats here in Canada for any reason? Do we know? Because if Nick was on here, I'd ask her. She tends to have that information kind of at her fingertips. Any of you know if we malt the oats at any point in time? And what else was different? And Fionnan, you said that the malted oats become heavier, which it didn't make sense to me. I figure if it's malted, it's dried, it should be lighter.
Well, they're not measuring them dry; they're measuring them as green malt. So but yeah, the reference, and it's funny because again, like in the book, because you see that sometimes the like disparity that they swell, and there's a lot of stuff in that book that was me repeating what was received trade information that had I been writing it now, I would have questioned. So for instance, yes, the trade understanding is that malted oats dropped out because the malt tax was based on weight and oats swell. Now, the malt tax in Ireland was 1785. Malted oats were outright banned in 1796. That to me is a much better reason why they fell out, when the government stepped in to preserve malted oats and wheat wherever possible for bread, so making it difficult and not as high yielding, saying, well, okay, we can't stop them using bread grains for distilling, but we can make it less worth their while. Now, it didn't work because unmalted oats and unmalted wheat continue to get used. But so you see that, and that reference to oat swelling comes from a very, very, reliable. E.B. Maguire wrote a tax history of Irish whiskey. It's a history of the excise, really. And I believe that was where I found that. And okay, that makes sense. So, some of this stuff with a lot of time behind me, having looked for the information in kind of nittier, grittier depth, I've questioned, some of the like short answers that I was given before. Absolutely. Now, I assume they do swell. I assume that made it a problem. But if I was a betting man, the illegalization of malted oats would be high on my list of reasons for it dropping out, Now, it may have been used behind the scenes anyway. There's a great debate about malt distillers. There's something called the malt drawback. And I was on I think it's out there. Dave Broom does a podcast called The Liquid Antiquarian. Yeah. But myself, I was on there as a guest, as part of a panel, really, on mixed mash bills in Scotland and this weird conundrum. And there's an argument about fraud, basically, and what counts as malt and what counts as, mixed mash. Because there was something called the malt drawback, which said if you made single malt, you got tax breaks. And a lot of it was meant to coddle Ireland into making malt whiskey, more like Scotland. And they get really annoyed by this because it says if you're to get these tax breaks, you can't have raw barley on site. And, one of the distillers is saying, well, all the malting is done at the distillery, so we have to bring in the raw barley at the time.
At one point.
Someone can just point to it and say, well, we haven't malted it yet, but we'll do it soon, and then, so again, these things like, well, were they using raw oats or were they malting them for a higher, so again, like there's a lot there you're dealing with, like, okay, it was officially illegal. But that's not to say somebody wasn't doing it. But again, you don't want to build those suppositions into so they'll have to remain suppositions,
until you have proof. Panel, let's get you involved in this. Cheryl and Kent, which one of you have the Kilbeggan?
Ironically, both of us now.
He finished his other glass. Now he's moved on.
All right. Tell us what you think of the Kilbeggan, because Sean and Dave and I talked about it previously. What do you get on the Kilbeggan?
It's absolutely the worst. Yeah, no.
We both love it.
You're going to have to give it to me, and we'll be fine.
I'm not giving it up.
No.
All right. You don't have to. You just bought it today, and you were sent away to do it. So I would hold on to that, too. And I wouldn't give them one if I were you.
It's really tasty. Like, we haven't been much into Irish whiskeys, but this is fabulous.
Yeah.
And you guys were watching last week, because your comments were on the side. We talked about the creamy versus the oily, and you have to take more of a mouthful, though. If you take your mouthful and you swish it around, do you see how the creamy comes out?
Yeah, absolutely cream.
Okay,
It's like farm cream.
I'm really happy that I can figure this out. It's been a long time. I told you guys, and I've done this. I've had heavy cream and I've had oil in my mouth trying to tell the difference. And I still couldn't. And it came to last week, and it was just take a bigger mouthful and swish around. It's like, got it. Thank you. Because you're not taking a big mouthful of oil.
Texture, the more you have in your mouth, obviously, the more apparent texture becomes. So if you're just taking again, eyedroppers, it's going to be very difficult.
Coming from the Scotch side, we're always, sipping it and taking little bits on our tongue. Yeah. And whereas, this is like, take a gulp. Right?
Yeah, I mean, Irish pot still, treat it with love and respect and time. But yeah, I mean, let it push about. It is a chewable drink, and it's a heavy drink, and it works in that context so well. Have enough in there to feel
I did find this one to be more oily, though.
Yeah,
which is also very pleasing to the palate. I quite enjoyed that one. I gotta lean to the Kilbeggan for overall flavor profile, though.
Yeah.
Okay, and let's go to Jason, because Jason, you and I have the yellow spot. And if we go back to this page, if you remember, right there, that page, yellow spot is glossy, as opposed to it's we go from oily to creamy to glossy to filmy. So I'm wondering what glossy is. So you put yours in you take a good swig. I'll do the same thing, and we're gonna have Fionnan tell us what glossy is.
Well, I wish I had some yellow spot to hand, but yeah, there's a weird and of course it's complicated by even just the different barrel finishes can change. When you're theoretically taste and texture are two different things, but they influence each other. You're always guided by something. If you're tasting something really bitter and it's you're deciding between creamy and oily, you'll probably go with oily, regardless of what it feels like. Yeah. But there is that weird, especially with some of the sweetened, the like Malaga influence, they start taking on this weird, slippery feeling. It's not the heaviness, it's not the semi-physical oil, and it's not the kind of creamy lipidus. It is a kind of like a how would you put it? Well, just that again, like gloss, that weird feeling of something that is slipping around your mouth, rather than, again, like just chewy, kind of heavy pot still. It's a weird, some of the IDL blends have it as well. When you mix pot still with grain whiskey, where it's softened down. I mean, Jameson, for example, is only 20, odd percent pot still, and the rest is grain whiskey. Same way the blended Scotch is, your core blended Scotch is built, except with pot still instead of malt. And I found with some of the better IDL blends, what happens is you get that softening of the oil into a kind of a glossiness. But then some of the lighter pot stills have it as well, that weird feeling, and again, maybe it's just a sweetness that again, like they become slippery. It's the softest it gets. Filmy is a word I probably just created to create the one to describe the ones that don't have a lot of pot still texture. But glossy, I have a much clearer definition for, if I'm to do like glossy to creamy to oily to waxy, which is really what you're talking about, the artifact whiskeys where they taste really thick.
Okay. Sean?
Well, maybe you can tell from the legs on the glass, because if it's like the green spot is oilier and you can see the legs on it more than the yellow spot.
Yeah,
So
although of course, the big problem with, as you probably already know, with spirits and legs is alcohol itself creates legs. So, just in terms of the strength of the delivery, you can really mess up any way of calculating dram to dram. Like a cat will always have so it's unreliable. Like if you had two side by side, you might be able to do it, but it's difficult, like getting something at a bar and saying, oh well, the legs on that mean will be an oilier, because if it just turns out to be a 46% versus a 40%, you're going to start seeing differences, and
wine being 11 to 14% generally, it's such a small difference between them. So you get more of an idea with wine than we do with, we go with our cask strengths that we have and go down to a 43 or 46%. There's a big difference, or a 40, which we don't drink a whole bunch of. Sean, can you do me a favor and put up your bottle? Sorry, Sean. Put up your Middleton bottle, because Fionnan talked about this bottle specifically several times. So I'm wondering if you could tell me what the mouthfeel is on the Barry Crockett.
Oh God! I don't drink that stuff often. It's not cheap. And here's me sitting around with Redbreast 21. Well, not anymore. This is the tail end of it. But one thing, I'll put it this way: a lot of the information in that book came from one interview. I went down to Middleton, and I was supposed to be shown around the place, and they were basically doubling the size of the facility at that time. There's huge works going on, and so they just took Barry and myself and sent us to a cafe in Middleton town and said, look, just interview him. And that was wonderful, because I didn't need to see the place, I needed to talk to him, and just sat down and went, and I didn't know, I had no idea he was about to retire. And I probably wore the ears off him, and he was probably wishing there was some authority figure who would like lug me away. So, well, you described the textural difference between Green Spot and John's Lane, and what about the taste? And he's probably just thinking, I need to get out of this. I need to settle down. He retired shortly after that interview. So, but probably the release of Barry Crockett Legacy was a giveaway even then. And I remember him talking about, and a lot of people, myself included, wax lyrical about old Dublin pot still, old real John's Lane, in the same way people wax about, Stitzel Weller or Port Ellen or whatever, the John's Lane distillery is very much that, the original pot still powers. And it's like really waxy, dark, leathery, wood shoppy, tobacco-y, gingery pot still. And he's saying, for all the attention that's made that there was the Cork style of pot still, and great, you'll never meet a Cork person who doesn't tell you there was a Cork alternative to Dublin. In all things, there's secretly a better version made in Cork. It's for those who haven't been, Cork has very much kind of second city syndrome. Wonderful place, but
I went to a wedding in Cork. It's a lovely place.
Yeah, there's graffiti, when you go in, and there's big kind of like USSR looking graffiti, that kind of art, and it says, end Dublin rule and Cork. Anyway, what he was saying was, if you look at the old Cork distillers, he said, there was this Cork pot still that was much more fruity, but fruit in the pot still rather than the malt sense, this kind of melony fruit. And he was talking about pears and things. And I was like, what on earth is he on about? And I was thinking about, you get old Middleton distillery bottlings that come out of Middleton, like original, the Cork Distillers Company. And they do have this weird mix of waxy leafiness and a kind of a soft melony type thing. And the two modern bottles that really push that forward for me are the Paddy Centenary, which was a one-off, and the Barry Crockett Legacy, which isn't.
Good.
And it's that weird idea of fruity pot still, because you think of, Redbreast is fruity in the sense dried old fruit, medjool dates, candied figs, that kind of autumnal stuff. But, when you think of malt spirit generally is much fruitier than pot still, when you talk about high estery kind of fruity. And but the terms he was kicking around were again green apple and pear and things. And when you have the Barry Crockett legacy, you get that sense of like melon and fruit, but they're all made. It's melon is a great one because melon is also kind of textural. You know, you also get that like fleshy kind of fruit. You know, and pot still oil works in fruitiness in that way. And that's one thing I love about the Barry Crockett legacy, and that has a little bit of virgin oak in it as well, which amps up that side of it. But yeah, lovely. But again, for me, it's like drinking a melon. You know, like some sort of like cantaloupe honeydew concoction with pot still texture. It's wonderful. You know.
How are you enjoying your melon there, Sean?
Well, I love it, but I wanted to. I don't know. I just found this. So it's Jameson Crested. Now it used to have a 10-year age statement on it. Doesn't anymore. This is the first time I ever saw it in Edmonton. It was at a little ma and pa liquor store. But after knowing about it and seeing about it, it's a higher pot still ratio in a Jameson, and it's a little bit older stock than a regular Jameson. So I literally cracked it this week, and it's phenomenal. If you don't mind Jameson, which most bars you go to, that's what they have for Irish whiskey. This is taking Jameson up 10 notches. I highly recommend, if you ever see a bottle of it, grab it.
Now, Sean, just a bit of behind the scenes. Crested 10, despite having the name, Crested 10 was not a 10-year-old, which is part of the reason they took it off. So it was in text, it wasn't like Crested and then 10-year-old. But it had been called Crested 10 since the 70s. So, the long after, it may have been a 10-year-old at the original, it may not have been even then, but it was called Crested 10. In fact, I have a bottle. Hold on.
You're sneaky, eh? I love this. And Sean, I'm going to ask you about Middleton and why you like it and don't like it, because you have a love-hate with them a little bit.
I do.
That's what it used to look like.
Oh, okay.
It was part of the text, and so eventually they took it off that. But yeah, even then it wasn't a 10-year-old.
For me, Middleton, don't get me wrong, it's beautiful whiskey. I love it. I have the whole range all the way up to the 21. In the Redbreast, but to me, Redbreast being the most familiar pot still that anybody knows,
I think
but
so.
it's all heavily aged in wine casks and sherry, Oloroso. So to me, I tend to, if somebody asks me for a pot still to try, I always turn to the Kilbeggan or the Drum Shambo,
because it's in a different cask. It's in a neutral.
It's in a neutral or ex-American
bourbon,
sometimes fresh oak, and to me it lets the pot still character shine through way more than say the 12, which is heavily sherry, or even the Listau. Now the Listau is probably my favorite Redbreast. I'm a sherry head by nature. I love everything sherry, but if you want to get the true essence of what a pot still should be or can be, I tend to go to a virgin or a bourbon oak pot still to showcase that. Then I'll pour them, a 21 right behind it so they can see what a beautiful pot still with a super long age in those casks can do, because they both need to be present. But to get the true essence, you generally tend to push them towards the bourbon barrel or virgin oak ones.
Okay, or the Irish oak, which I'm really looking forward to finding right now. So yeah, thank you, Sean. I appreciate that. Fionnan, same thing. Do you agree with, because you do like the sherry influence as well? But you were talking about how people would stay away from the 15-year-old because there was too much sherry.
Well, so yeah, you find it heaps of people who drink 12, especially 12-year-old cask strength over the 15-year-old. The 15-year-old gets kind of lost because the 21-year-old, and also Middleton, when it comes down to make different styles of distillate in-house and then mix them after the fact. So Redbreast is a mixture of what's called light pot and mod pot. And Redbreast 12 and Redbreast 15 are that. Redbreast 21 and the recently released Redbreast 27 actually have some heavy pot in them as well. So not even quite the same thing. And I think the heavy pot lends itself to kind of giving a bit more distillate character with it, in the way that like malt whiskey as well. When you get older, you start getting the cask more and more dominant, and heavy pot is put into the older redbreast to kind of reground it in oil, and it works really well. Whereas Redbreast 15 isn't, is more time in sherry for the 12, as it were. And Redbreast 15 is it's the original one that was done for La Maison de Whiskey, the 2005 Redbreast 15, which also had a little bit of trad or heavy pot in it, has become a bit of a cult item. But that's all kinds of obscure. The contemporary one, it's essentially a more sherried version. Whereas the 12, especially the Redbreast 12 cask strength, is probably my desert island whiskey. In fact, almost certainly, and it is so, because again, like oil and high alcohol work so well together, because high alcohol is just a mouth drying sensation, and pot still is such an oily sensation that it's this like liquid paradox. Like, why is it so dry and so oily at the same time? And then the gingers work so well with that mouth drying sensation, and then the sherry kicks through. But yeah, if I was to give someone a pot still for the first time, like Sean, probably the one I would reach for would be Powers John's Lane, just as a way of again delivering that kind of pot still left on its own devices kind of thing. But definitely like even we try some of the cask strength. Even
I'm glad we're having an influence on you as well, there, Fionnan.
Oh, don't worry. Long been under the influence. Been a long lockdown. One thing about the Middleton, because it's funny, because I love a lot of the Middleton pot stills. Never been a fan of Middleton Very Rare ever. I understand in the 1980s it was released as a kind of Irish answer to Johnny Walker Blue or to the premium blended Scotch. And it was important at the time to kind of give Irish whiskey a certain sense of dignity, a certain sense of aspirationalism. Like, I understand what it did for Irish whiskey. I think now, I don't have a lot of time for Johnny Walker Blue either. They're kind of commodity whiskeys. They're for the guy who wants to spend big on they're the douchebag whiskeys. We
talked about that last week, the douchebag whiskey.
Yeah, and quite frankly, I'm not, like Johnny Walker Blue, they're very well put together. They're soft, they're accessible, they're inoffensive. But when you have these, when you have Redbreast cask strength at, a fraction of the price, why I would never bother. And the Middleton pot stills, but with the flip side of that, the Barry Crockett legacy is like what Middleton Very Rare ought to be. Melon and it's fruity, it's a bit more luxurious, but it's also kind of plush, and you kind of feel the again, like the melony water kind of trickle down. It has body, it has guts. But every I've never been blown away by Middleton Very Rare ever. And now they've become even more expensive than they used to, because they're really, now that Irish whiskey is trending, they're going into the kind of pappy zone. And Middleton Distillery is probably my favorite. If the book didn't make it clear, probably my favorite distillery on earth. But Middleton Very Rare ranks, relatively low. And
how much is it for you there? It's 300.
I don't buy it. It pops up, and now it's on the secondary market all the time. Especially within the last year or two, it has really skyrocketed into the auction and the cynical auction prices, where people snap it up and then just stick it up on auction. I didn't have an enormous kind of interest in it before, and I have substantially less so now. It's there's so many great things that come out of Middleton I'm so much more passionate about than
than that. Well, thank you, kind sir, and thank you for showing us the Crested 10. I'm glad you actually had that bottle to show us. That's really cool. I would usually do last thoughts from everyone, but I want to try to get it under an hour. So, Fionnan, your last thoughts, and then we'll just talk in the after and after Dram.
Oh God.
We did the hour. We're done.
I can only reaffirm the cask strength. This particular one, if you can, I think I brought this up before. 2016. You want to talk about things I would buy at auction? 2016 and 2019 Redbreast cask strength. Those are the horse betting tips. If you can see those, they're usually not that much more than a normal one, because who chases odd years of Redbreast cask strength? But of course, Redbreast cask strength is done on a batch to batch system, and some years it just stands out. It's electrifying stuff, that would be closing thoughts that weren't in the book.
Good
The
to
book
know.
came out
I'm glad.
2015.
See, we get new stuff here as well. Everything. Ladies and gentlemen, Whiskey Brothers, Whiskey Sisters, that's it. It's been a fantastic afternoon. Thanks to our listeners. Thank you to the panel, everyone on the panel. Dave, Jason, McDaddy, Kent, Sean, it's been absolute pleasure spending this time with you all. And Cheryl, who's there as well. I've got to say that. And Dave in the corner. Thanks, bud. A special thanks to Fionnan. Another great week. I really appreciate the time. So here, ladies and gentlemen, is to good company. Here, all of you on the side, good company. Here's to good whiskey. Here's to good books right there. Here's to good conversation. And here's to seeing you all next week, Saturday, May 22nd at 12 o'clock Mountain Daylight Time and 7 o'clock Irish Standard Time for our Whiskey Book Club's 11th book review and our last segment of this book right here, A Glass Apart, Irish Single Pot Still Whiskey by Fionnan O'Connor. And it's going to be a sad time, but you should really still be there. And, well, we're going to talk more about alcohol, more about whiskey, more about things and say. So I'm just going to stick to the whiskey. We've decided that. Thank you all. And this will be the end. Sláinte once all.